speak to you directly, and I'm used to lecturing in big halls, and so do you find that you can hear me at the back? Yes, so I have prepared a paper especially for this time in the United Kingdom, and the paper is entitled "Cheney in the Bunker, Cheney in Canada, a credibly accused war criminal reflects on Al-Qaeda and the War of 1812. So that might seem like a strange concoction of subjects, but let me give you a little bit of background. Now, these volumes together are the bowl with one spoon. This is a 16-year project. It's published by McGill Queen's University Press. And as I was working on the second volume, my friend Splitting the Sky kind of more or less ordered me, said, you have to get off the fence on 9/11, you have to figure it out. I had been very much of the blowback school. Aha, finally the colonized people were so abused, so maltreated, that finally the colonized people got themselves organized to make a statement, a powerful statement. And I must admit, that was I was attached to that because my field in history is in Native American studies or Native studies. So nevertheless, Splitting the Sky, who was charged with killing a policeman in the Attica prison riot in 1971. It was the biggest prison event in history, really, in the history of the United States. So he was in jail for 17 years. His lawyer was Ramsey Clark, former Attorney General of the United States. He's used to dealing with really tough situations, power. Anyway, he said you have to look at this. And of course I spent a couple of days on the internet, and it's impossible once you start to look at the evidence not to realize that it isn't anything like the causes of what happened on 9/11 are nothing like what we were told. So I took that into account and started to realize I had to make a drastic reworking of my text, because although the history deals with globalization since 1492, 5 centuries of what I see as imperial colonization appropriating resources from indigenous people, demonizing and marginalizing indigenous people by saying, well, this is imperial thrust, this isn't about taking your resources, it's about bringing civilization to savages. That old paradigm, it's about bringing Christianity to infidels. So I could see this war on terror very much replicated old patterns in history that go back to the Spanish empire building, the Portuguese empire building, the French empire building, the British empire building, always justified in this imperative of civilization to ascend over savagery, this imperative of democracy to ascend over tyranny. The same meme is drawn out again and again. So I committed myself at that point. Once you go over the line, I got sick for a couple of days. Just the startling revelation that the world isn't constructed how one thinks, and so I reworked Earth into Property and integrated this interpretation of 9/11 and the 9/11 wars into a big historical treatment. So that's the background of this. Now let me just jump forward to 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago I was at the Vancouver Club in Vancouver, in British Columbia, the commercial capital of British Columbia, which is the westernmost province of Canada. And Dick Cheney was speaking there. He was promoting his new book, In My Time. And about 500 of us converged on the Vancouver Club, as we had done in Calgary in 2009 when Bush was speaking in Calgary. We converged to say, Canadian authorities must arrest Dick Cheney. And it was a very spirited spirited occasion. Perhaps I could give you a preview, a little bit of a sense of what that was like. So this is you notice this has had over 5,000 hits, so there's quite an interest in this subject. We could raise the sound, we could turn the sound up.
This is a dark day for Canada.
Can we turn the sound up?
The Canadian Parliament passed a statute, the Canadian Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act. And that states that Canada is not to be a haven. It's not to give refuge for war criminals. In my view, the most obvious, notorious war criminal, or credibly accused war criminal, because he hasn't had a trial yet, is Dick Cheney. Deeply connected with torture, deeply connected with genocide, deeply connected with aggressive warfare, which the tribunal on the Nuremberg.
It's BT again, isn't it? Just loading in.
Something going on here. An error, please try again later. So this is embedded in an article in Veterans Today. And so I put this paper that I prepared to deliver right here and now. We just a day or so ago put it up on a website called Veterans Today. And that is a very interesting website where the preponderance of people who write on the website, the people who run the website, the people who comment on the website, who many of them work for the CIA formerly, they work for FBI, there are people who worked in the national security state in different ways. And it's taken as a given that 9/11 is an inside job. That is a understanding from inside the national security state. And I would say that one of the very interesting patterns that you see in Veterans Today is the view that, these are officials or people who worked inside the military system. Yes, we rape, we pillage, we kill people, but historically we did that in our own interest, or some perception of our own interest. Now the perception is somehow the Israeli government interests preempted U.S. interests, and there's been a kind of coup d'etat where people feel betrayed, people within the structure. So I could probably race through the paper. It's about 28 pages. I could probably race through it and read it in the time available. But you can all read. You can all find your way to websites and such. So I'm going to speak to the subject of the paper. And I want to convey to you, my sense was, coming from Canada, I want to tell you something about what it's like, what's going on there. Canada, of course, emerged from the conservative side of the Civil War in North America that gave rise to the existence of the United States. Canada exists because some folks didn't buy into the founding of the United States. They kept with the British Empire. And here we are at the core of the imperial capital of the British Empire. So I thought I would try to give some sense of what's going on in Canada. And if you had been able to see the rest of this YouTube, you can see that it was a very spirited, principled gathering of people. And historically, I found, the peace activists will say, well, please keep 9/11 off to the side. We want to be attractive to the mainstream. We want to be attractive. But that is breaking down. I honestly find that to be breaking down. And I really feel that the 9/11 truth movement is the heart of the anti-war movement right now, because you cannot deal, yeah, go ahead, give me a little affirmation. The 9/11 wars, with 9/11 truth, we address and deal with the 9/11 wars, and alternatively, you can't just deal with the outgrowth of 9/11 without dealing with what actually happened on that day. So I could see that happening in Vancouver. I could see, well, 5,000 hits. I'm not used to getting that many hits on a little 4-minute YouTube. And so I want to talk about the specifics of Cheney in Canada, Cheney in the bunker. When I say Cheney in the bunker, Dick Cheney, of course, was in charge of the military system in the bunker underneath the White House. On 9/11 itself, George Bush, who is a kind of figurehead, not really seen as that an adept person, Cheney is largely recognized as a hands-on person. So there he is, left in charge of the system on 9/11, with the President of the United States reading a story about a pet goat to children in Sarasota, Florida. Does he go back to Washington? No, he doesn't go back to Washington. He takes off in Air Force One. Is there a fighter escort with Air Force One? No, there isn't. So this Cheney in the bunker is a legendary moment. There are songs about it. It's a very pivotal aspect of trying to figure out what happened on 9/11. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but the larger picture that I draw in my text, and then I just want to get out very clearly, and my time is, so I've got, say, 20 more minutes. I want to get out very clearly that the big picture of 9/11 is that the military-industrial complex, the permanent war economy, the reality that the United States of America, the leader, the capitalist leader in the Cold War, since 1941, it builds up its military apparatus, its research and development arms, and at the core of its political economy is this war machine, which is directed during the Cold War at the Soviet Union, and primarily at the Soviet Union. At the core of the political economy is this idea that communism threatens our way of life, is a sort of atheistic assault on decent God-fearing values, and must be opposed psychologically, must be opposed in the universities, must be opposed in the media, must be opposed through building up tremendous militarization of space, of submarines. So you have this whole political economy geared to anti-communism, and suddenly the Soviet Union is no longer there. It disappears, and so you've got this whole political economy. So who's going to be the new enemy? Are you going to change the political economy of the United States, or are you going to try to retain that political economy and I would say invent a new enemy? So Dick Cheney is a powerful embodiment of the military-industrial complex. His job before becoming the hands-on operative of the Bush administration was president of Halliburton from 1995 to 2000. Dick Cheney goes back to 1975. At age 33, he becomes Gerald Ford's primary secretary, the head of the office, the person closest to the president. Who put him there? His friend and patron, Donald Rumsfeld, who had that job previously. So in Peter Dale Scott's book, The Road to 9/11, he describes the road to 9/11 as primarily this alliance between Rumsfeld and Cheney. Cheney goes on to become defense secretary during the presidency of George H.W. Bush. I'd love to get some water. My mouth is very dry. He works for the Jewish Institute on National Security. For a time, he's a congressman for Wyoming. And so he's at the very nub of executive power in the United States. And he and Rumsfeld are developing the emergency measures operations. So what happens if there's a nuclear war? What happens to government? So they develop a whole system of arrangements for it starts with planning for nuclear war, but they make very certain there's other provisions in case other things happen. So the very arrangements, political arrangements, institutional transformations that take place on 9/11, Cheney created those. He was there for 30 years planning for those eventualities. And so, you know, he's a very powerful embodiment. We can talk about him as a person, but of course, you know, to demonize him, I mean, he obviously is an embodiment of a whole system of power relationships. To think it's all about him as a madman or a criminal, well, yes, those things are true, but let's try to see the larger patterns here. And you know, he embodies something much larger than himself. So on the morning of 9/11, what time did Cheney enter the bunker? So Norman Mineta, the transportation secretary, says that when he entered the bunker, the secret installation, or the installation where you run the military system, the emergency measure system, when he entered the bunker at 9:20, Cheney was already there giving orders. And one of the things that he apparently gave an order about, according to Norman Mineta, some official came in and said, the object is 50 miles out. The object is 30 miles out. The object is 10 miles out. Do the orders still stand, sir? And he said, yes. Have I said anything to the contrary? So this could lend itself to an interpretation that whatever hit the Pentagon was coming in, and you know, my view would be Cheney seems very involved in that Pentagon event, and that object that creates a little hole in the side of the Pentagon, that hits at 9:37. So Cheney's own account is he enters the bunker at 10 o'clock. And that's after the Pentagon event has already happened. So the timing is very crucial. And the reality that we have disparate accounts within the actual executive branch itself. From top-level executives, we have Mineta's account, which does not conform with Cheney's account. So, you know, it's I think an expression of how deprived we are of the basic information of what really happened on 9/11, that we don't even know at the heart of the whole system who was really in control. Was it Cheney? You know, it speaks to the failure to get any realistic account of what the situation is. Now, what happened on the morning of 9/11, of all the different scenarios unfolding? The one I'm going to emphasize right now is that it's well recorded that there was a threat on Air Force One. So Air Force One, after Bush dallies and isn't rushed out and takes his time seemingly and continues to read the story and seems disoriented, by the time he gets to Air Force One and takes off, and then it's very significant, they haven't had a chance apparently to get fighter jets to accompany Air Force One. They take off, and then there is a threat on Air Force One, and the heart of it is a message that comes through, and I'm going by Webster Tarpley's account here, a message that comes through the communication system on Air Force One that says Angel is next. Angel is Air Force One. That is the code, the secret code word for Air Force One. And the indication is somebody within the system has the key to getting into the communication system, the very communication system and control and command system that runs nuclear weapons. So it's a very powerful proof. And it is proof because I've seen myself, Ari Fleischer at the time said, well, we were under threat on Air Force One. We got a threat, a credible threat. And the record, as I was reading through, rereading Tarpley, he's got many newspaper articles cited. And so the allegation was that Bush is a coward. If it was Margaret Thatcher with IRA, she would go right back to her desk, have herself photographed in charge of the system and send out the message, we're not going to be intimidated. Does Bush do that? No. He goes to St. Louis, he goes to Nebraska, he goes into some sort of secret meeting, and he comes out of this secret meeting a new man. He's found his message. But in the early hours of 9/11, he is AWOL. He is in the most crucial hours of his presidency. He's taking off from where the action is happening, and Cheney is advising him to do so. So Tarpley asks, and I am asking, what was the nature of the discussion between Cheney and Bush? Was Cheney representing some position inside the government saying, look, you're going to be taken out, but if you do such and such and such and join us, you won't be taken out. So what was the nature of that communication? So those are our basic questions. So I get into the question of Cheney in the bunker. And then, I try to put this episode in the much broader context of, okay, United States doesn't have an enemy to justify it, what Seymour Melvin called its permanent war economy. Who's going to be the enemy? Well, then you have Benjamin Netanyahu, the head of the Likudnik faction in Israel, the right-wing faction in Israel. As early as 1979, they're having conferences trying to identify this thing called international terrorism. Now, we may take the word terrorism kind of, we've been so indoctrinated by the term, but what does it mean? The United States itself, after all, was founded by arms-bearing citizens who defied the duly constituted authority and rebelled against the British imperial crown. So now Benjamin Franklin and George Washington, they're heroes, but they could be seen as terrorists according to the definitions being used in these times. So it's a major, major ideological, intellectual leap to start to identify something called international terrorism as a kind of universal enemy. So it's a well-known phrase, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. I mean, the book, The End of History, it sort of implies, well, whoever is holding power now and controlling all the wealth, they must be holding that legitimately. And anybody who is going to question that and go against that, they're terrorists. And certainly the war on terror gives many regimes and governments around the world, including China, Djibouti, all kinds of these principalities in the Middle East, it gives the license to say, well, these are terrorists. We have to take stands against terrorists. So I try to put this larger thing in context and basically point out that the overwhelming evidence that we're aware of, that I'm talking about now, one tiny part of the buildings, the NORAD, what is Al-Qaeda, there's not one part of the official story that makes sense, that can be backed up by the available evidence. And this has a tremendously corrosive effect. I mean, when I watch the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, it's like watching cartoons or something. I hold those people in contempt. Because it's not just a matter of misinterpreting 9/11. I mean, the news we see every day is based on this primary fraud about what happened on 9/11. So it frames the master narrative of our time, and it creates the psyop in which we're living. And as I see it, the core of that psyop is the West is to be understood as a trajectory of Judeo-Christian history. Islam is to be seen as the aberrant, the other. So 9/11 creates this basis. As an educator, as somebody who works in the universities, I think it's very important to emphasize, hey, Western civilization, Islam has been integral to Western civilization. Whether we go back to Andalusia, Al-Andalus, whether we look at the history of Zero, whether we look at the Reformation and who did the translations and how is the Greco-Roman tradition, how were they brought forward? They were brought forward largely by Islamic scholars. So, to my way of thinking, this this need for an enemy. So Israel, the Likudnik faction, the right-wing faction of Israel, succeeds in establishing a paradigm where its enemies become the enemies of this idea of the West. Of course, what is the West? I mean, I come from Alberta, eastern foothills, the eastern slopes of the Rockies. I guess I come from the West. Is this the West? I mean, but we're barraged with this propaganda to see the West in a certain way and to somehow imagine that Arab people, that Islamic people, which is a much larger constituency, are somehow outside the West, hate the West, want to destroy the West. We're fed this paradigm all the time. So, so that's the basic thrust of the paper. But then I get into the historic section. And bear with me a little bit if this might seem a little unfamiliar, but I think it's really important, not only to look at the events of 9/11, but now we have to rewrite our history and reconceive the history of our modern times. And I must say, to teach this in the universities, and I have a graduate student, Joshua Blakeney, who is doing his thesis on the originating acts of the 9/11 wars, becomes quite humiliating to be in the academy in these days, to see all these professors with their great grants to study terrorism and such, and national security, but won't read David Ray Griffin. And if you're gonna say you're an expert on a topic, you have to do the basic readings you may disagree with those readings, but so I find myself much lonelier than I should be in the academy pursuing these topics. But I'm trying to sort of integrate this topic into my main, into my historical work, into my major subjects, and so I'll just read the last 2 pages, where I'm going to talk about the origins of the war on terror in the American Declaration of Independence. That the question of who is going to control the westward expansion, will it be the imperial government of Great Britain, or will it be the local land speculators who create their own new sovereign entity and say, why should we be a kind of sub-empire of the British Empire when we can have our own empire and benefit most directly from this western expansion, this appropriation of new resources and this privatization of land. And so this old story of appropriating resources from indigenous peoples, which is at the heart of the story of imperialism. I want to put the origins of the global war on terror back to 1776, July the 4th, 1776. So in drafting the American Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson gave voice to the hostility felt by many Anglo-Americans to the constraints placed on frontier expansion by even the limited recognition afforded Aboriginal rights in the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Now I should have a picture, but I'm not going to venture into the computer there. But after Canada was incorporated into the British Empire on the Plains of Abraham in what they call the 7 Years' War, 1754 to 1763, in that period, the British government decided that the lands beyond the Appalachian would be lands reserved to the Indians as their hunting grounds. And so this was a concession to the Montreal fur traders. Reserving the lands to the Indian was seen as abysmal in the 13 colonies. And there was a killing spree. The Paxton boys went and murdered many Indians just to mark their protest against the Royal Proclamation. And if at any time any of the said Indians should be inclined to dispose of the said lands, the same shall be purchased for us at some public meeting. This is the basis of Indian treaties in Canada. And BC, where Dick Cheney was speaking, we're making Indian treaties in Canada right now based on the Royal Proclamation of 1763. So I'm trying to draw together the threads of this question of the rule of law in British Columbia is particularly interesting. Now, Dick Cheney, in his book, he says, after I was After the day of 9/11, a helicopter took me over the Pentagon, and my goodness, I could think back to when the British burned down the White House. And I'm thinking, look at how vulnerable we are again, now to Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has shown us that they can make a hit, just as the British did, you know, inside our system. Actually, the War of 1812 was basically an Indian war. Indians rallied to defend their territories, which was Canada. They rallied because the Royal Proclamation gave them some assurance. There was some basis of the rule of law. They were hoping to create their own state, an Aboriginal dominion, to come to organize 13,000 warriors to fight the United States. So when Cheney is referring to the War of 1812, he's really referring to an Indian war. Even though the Royal Proclamation had only been sporadically and half-heartedly enforced, the drafter of the most consequential political manifesto ever issued, that's Thomas Jefferson, ended the document's condemnations aimed at the British monarch with the following accusation. So now I'm quoting the Declaration of Independence, you know, the most famous political manifesto in history and certainly the most consequential. He, King George, has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Now just contemplate, I'm reading from the American Declaration of Independence, the founding document of the United States of America, which is founded on a primal criminalization of the people standing on the resources that are about to be appropriated. And the provision in the founding document of the United States deserves much more attention than it's thus far been afforded. The accusation is telling that King George was considered guilty of some terrible crime for trying to incorporate indigenous peoples into the British Empire on the basis of the rule of law. We're standing there with our own police force in Canada saying, arrest Dick Cheney. Do we have a rule of law? We have a Canadian Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act. It doesn't get enforced. Why? Because it's not politically expedient. So we really don't have a rule of law. Rule of law it doesn't go to the highest end. The U.S. was founded on a primal criminalization of those societies indigenous to the lands of the new polity that the new polity was about to appropriate. The indigenous peoples on the new republic's western frontiers were afforded the identity of natural-born terrorists. They're terrorists. They're inclined to arbitrary violence, convicted without trial of being so violent and anarchistic that they could be counted on to visit undistinguished destruction even on women, children, the elderly, and the disabled. Thus it can be said that the global war on terror really began not on 9/11, but rather on July the 4th, 1776, when the technique was introduced of demonizing as bloodthirsty savages those indigenous people standing on valuable natural resources. The extension after 1776 of the American Declaration of Independence's criminalization and racial profiling to indigenous peoples on successive frontiers was demonstrated again and again in scores of Indian wars and unpunished vigilante killing sprees, facilitating the transcontinental expansion of the United States. In the 20th century, when redcoats and red Indians were no longer perceived as a threat, the red communists were cast in the role of the enemies of America's manifest destiny to dominate the world through the universalization of its political economy of militarization and domination. With the demise of the red communist foe, the empire of private property required a new enemy to replicate the role of merciless Indian savage in the 21st century. Emerging from the US-backed Mujahideen that was armed and financed by the United States to overthrow the Soviet-backed puppet regime in Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda was cast on 9/11 as the necessary other to be defeated in order to expand the frontiers of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But this pursuit of happiness, which tends to translate into the pursuit of property, has clearly run its course as the kleptocracy that once fed off the theft of resources of indigenous people has turned to the theft of family property from increasingly dispossessed and imperiled middle class. Dick Cheney's ease in making the move, in moving from the enemies of the nascent U.S. empire in the War of 1812 to the new enemies of Anglo-American Israeli empire in the 9/11 wars, helps to clarify the persistence of primal patterns of imperial expansion into the 21st century. The justification for the imperial expansion that began in 1492 was based on the claim that the Spanish conquistadors of America was directed at saving savages from the eternity of hell through the salvation of the Roman Catholic faith. The meaning of civilization's imperative to ascend over savagery found its way into the founding manifesto of the United States of America. As Dick Cheney's reflection on the history of his own country attests, it seems the global war on terror has brought the Imperial Republic back to its Indian fighting roots. The finer spirit of the Indian provisions in the Royal Proclamation of 1763 would seem to point the way to a route of escape. We're talking about the rule of law. We're not going to take land unilaterally. People have to consent to be incorporated into empires. It would seem to point the way to a route of escape from the anti-Indian provisions of the American Declaration as now globalized through a fraudulent interpretation of 9/11. The heritage of the Royal Proclamation extends from the politics of Pontiac, Sir William Johnson, and Tecumseh, all the way to the process, however imperfect, of the negotiating Crown Aboriginal treaties in British Columbia. Alternatively, Dick Cheney is the inheritor of the legacy of the Paxton Boys, who murdered many Indigenous peoples with impunity. Hence, one of the core dilemmas of our time was embodied by the hosting of Cheney in a venue associated, and it turns out that the Vancouver Club has a scandal in its background, that it was the center of a pedophilia ring, where Aboriginal children were handed over. Somehow there was something poetic about that. So I described that in the essay, which you can find in Veterans Today, and it's a very interesting website. Hence, one of the core dilemmas of our time was embodied by the hosting of Cheney in a venue associated with the sexual brutalization of Aboriginal children by rich and influential pedophiles who are treated as if they are above the law.